Unlike most countries in the world, trucks in the Soviet Union played a much greater role. People could live without private cars, walking was healthy, and public transport in the USSR worked quite well. But trucks were different. There was simply nothing that could replace them. They were needed everywhere, on construction sites, in factories, and in agriculture. The entire Soviet machine depended on them. There were heavy haulers for quarries and construction, the Kraz trucks. There were highway workhorses, the Maz trucks. Yet among all Soviet trucks, one stood apart. It was the ZIL-130. It wasn't the most powerful or the most capable, but it was the most important. It was the backbone of the system. The ZIL-130 worked everywhere, from Siberia to Central Asia, from construction sites to army convoys. The list of its duties seemed endless. This is the story of its creation, its golden years, and why, nearly 70 years later, this truck is still working and still valued by both drivers and companies. This is the story of the main truck of the Soviet Union. In the 1940s and even the 1950s, working conditions for Soviet truck drivers were, to put it mildly, harsh. The fleet mostly consisted of 3-ton ZIL-5 and 1.5-ton GAZ AA. Some of these trucks had survived the war. Others were built in the post-war years. You might ask, why keep making such archaic trucks all the way up to 1950? The answer's simple. Because there wasn't much choice. The western part of the country was in ruins. The economy and infrastructure were in rough shape. Still, these old machines kept doing their job. On construction sites, in collective farms, and even in the army. Structurally, the ZIL-5 and GAZ AA dated back to the late 1920s, and by the 1950s were completely outdated. But they were cheap, and they did what they were built for, hauling cargo. Comfort wasn't part of the deal, though. These trucks didn't even have a cabin heater, and the USSR wasn't exactly known for its warm climate. Drivers had to improvise. The usual trick was cutting holes in the dashboard, if you could even call it that, to let warm air from the engine into the cabin. The result was barely effective, and along with the heat came exhaust fumes and the smell of burnt fuel. Things were a bit better thanks to the Lend-Lease trucks delivered during the war. Technically, everything supplied under the agreement was supposed to be returned, but the USSR bought out part of the vehicles and kept them in service through the post-war years. By the early 1950s, it was clear. The era of pre-war trucks was coming to an end. Imported machines broke down fast without spare parts, and the ZIL and GAZ trucks were beyond repair. Gradually, they disappeared from the roads, especially in big cities, moving out to the countryside. It wouldn't be right to say that, apart from the old ZIL and GAZ trucks, the Soviets had nothing else. Work on a new model had actually started before the war. In 1937, engineers at the ZIS factory began developing a truck under the index ZIS-15. It was meant to replace the already aging ZIS-5. The first prototype appeared in March 1939, but the war ruined all plans. The factory switched to producing the proven, if outdated, designs. The project was shelved until better times. Those better times came only in 1943, when it became clear that the war would eventually end and the country would need new equipment. Boris Fitterman was appointed chief designer. He'd later make a career designing everything from compact cars to government limousines. The new model was designated ZIS-150. The first prototype was built that same year, 1943, and to save time it used a cab from the American International Harvester, KR-11. The next prototypes, built in 1944, already had an original cab, though its American influence was obvious. Full-scale production started in 1947. Steel was in short supply back then, so the early cabs were made of wood and metal. Even with that limitation, the truck was a real step forward in terms of comfort. For the first time, drivers got a heater, ventilation, and more cabin space. Starting in 1949, the factory began switching to all-metal cabs, and by 1952, wooden parts were gone completely. In 1956, the Stalin factory was renamed the Likhachov factory, and the ZIS-50 became the ZIL-164. Essentially, it was the same truck, but with a number of upgrades. a stronger frame, improved cooling system, and finally, an oil filter under the hood. The cabin got a bit quieter, and the ventilation worked better. The ZIL-164 became the main workhorse of the Soviet Union through the early 1960s. But by the mid-50s, it was clear. Time had come to think about a replacement. The truck, no matter how you looked at it, was aging fast. On August 29, 1956, the Ministry of Automotive Industry of the USSR approved the technical specification for a new truck, the ZIL-130. The specification also required that the ZIL-130 platform be developed into a tractor unit and a 3-axle all-wheel drive variant for the Army, the model that would later become the ZIL-131. The plan called for a 6-cylinder inline petrol engine with 130 horsepower. Anatoly Krieger became chief designer, having previously worked at the Gorky automobile plant. Just a few months after the specification was approved, in 1956, the factory assembled the first prototypes. The pace of the work was impressive and not accidental. For several years, the plant had been modernizing the ZIL-150 and ZIL-164. So many solutions were already ready. Krieger also knew exactly what to aim for. He had spent a long time working in the United States, had seen how production was organized there, and understood how a modern truck should look. It was only natural that the 1956 Dodge C3 TA8 became the point of reference. That truck served as the benchmark when creating the future workhorse, the ZIL-130. After the first test batch of 2 ZIL-130 prototypes went through trials, it became clear. The inline 6 wasn't right for the 130. On paper, everything looked fine, but in reality, the engine showed a whole set of design flaws. Fixing them would have been long, expensive, and pointless. The inline 6 project was shut down, and in the next prototype built in 1957, engineers installed a new engine, a V8 detuned to 150 horsepower. That one turned out to be a success, reliable, torquey, and it eventually became the very heart of the production ZIL-130. The technical side of the project moved fast. Decisions were made, tested, and approved. But then came an unexpected twist with the design. When you compare the first and second ZIL-130 prototypes, it's clear the second one got much more attention. It featured more complex shapes and a more curved panoramic windshield, something the designers were especially proud of. Sure, its form was inspired by American trucks of the time, but the new glass offered an almost perfect field of vision with no blind spots. Plus, it simply looked far more interesting than a flat windshield. However, the military immediately objected to these design experiments. An official statement from the Ministry of Defense said, "Panoramic windshields are unacceptable for Army vehicles because of the difficulties in replacing them and the problems of transporting curved glass." The cab design also raised many questions. Initially, it was planned that the civilian and military ZIL trucks would share the same cab, which made perfect sense, as it simplified production and reduced costs. But while the first prototype's cab was mostly acceptable to the military, the second one wasn't. Stripping away the formal language, their main argument was basically, sure, it looks nice, but who in the Army is going to do bodywork on all this beauty? In the end, the military insisted on simplifying the cab design for their version, giving it a more utilitarian look. Finding a compromise took time, but eventually, they got there. The panoramic windshield stayed, but on the military version, it was split down the middle. The civilian and military ZIL trucks got different front-end designs. The civilian one looked just as the stylists had intended, while the military version followed the Army's preferences. At the same time, all the body panels were interchangeable. So, skipping ahead a bit, it wasn't unusual to see a civilian ZIL-130 on the road with a cab from a ZIL-131. In most cases, it just meant the front end had been replaced, maybe after an accident or for some other practical reason. For the first time in the USSR, serious attention was paid to the driver's workplace. Along with the panoramic windshield that gave excellent visibility, the ZIL-130 finally got power steering, something its predecessor didn't have. On the old trucks, turning the wheel at low speeds was a real workout. doable only for very strong men. Now, that was in the past. The seat also became much softer. For the first time in the Soviet Union, it was made using latex foam filling. Before that, all truck seats were spring-based, which wasn't terrible, but springs tended to break and poke through the upholstery over time. On top of that came a more effective heater and ventilation system, and a powerful enough engine to handle heavy loads with ease. Driving a truck was still hard work, but with the arrival of the ZIL-130, it was no longer back-breaking labor. There was also a symbolic touch. Almost all Soviet trucks before that were painted green, so they could be quickly mobilized for the army if war broke out. But the ZIL-130 came in a bright blue cab with a white front. It wasn't just a color choice. It was a statement. Times were changing, and militarism was finally stepping back. On October 1st, 1964, mass production of the ZIL-130 officially began. At first, these were mostly flatbed trucks and bare chassis. The factory itself produced only the base versions, while other specialized plants installed bodies and equipment for specific purposes. Probably the most famous of these plants was located in Mytishchi, near Moscow. That's where the dump truck versions of the 130 were built. Chassis arrived there by rail, straight from the main ZIL conveyor, where they were fitted with dump bodies and hydraulic lifts. Not far from there, in Balashika, stood the main Soviet factory for producing fire trucks. That's where both the ZIL-130 and the 131 were turned into firefighting vehicles. Fire trucks based on the 130 were much less common, even in cities with paved roads. The 131 was considered the main fire engine almost everywhere, since its off-road capability gave it a clear advantage. The 130, meanwhile, was usually assigned to less critical units, so you didn't see it in action that often. Besides these two major plants, there were many others that modified the standard ZIL in their own way, fitting it with tanks, mobile workshops, crew cabins, or various special-purpose bodies. Its design made the truck easy to adapt for almost any task, and that flexibility was one of the main reasons it became so widespread. Overall, production got off to a strong start, and feedback from drivers and fleet managers made it clear. The truck turned out to be a success. But the ZIL-130 lineup wasn't limited to the standard and special versions already mentioned. There was also supposed to be a northern modification. And of course, it needed to be tested before going into production. In 1965, a major endurance run took place across the northern regions of the USSR. It included the new ZIL-130s, as well as their predecessors, the 164s, most likely for comparison. The convoy covered thousands of kilometers, driving in daytime temperatures of -40 and nighttime lows reaching -60 degrees Celsius. The northern version differed from the standard model with extra insulation in the cab, a more powerful heater, and double-glazed windows. During these trials, engineers tested everything: cold starts, the cooling and heating systems, air filters, the durability of the body, wiring, and tires in extreme cold. Special attention was paid to how well the engines could start in the morning after freezing overnight. The northern versions were already equipped with an engine preheater system. So, unlike the old days, there was no longer any need to build a fire under the engine to warm it up.
Новое лучше всего познается в сравнении. Местным водителям не мешает наглядно убедиться в преимуществе новых автомобилей.
These tests became a key part of fine-tuning the northern package. And, based on the results, many small improvements were made to the design. The ZIL-130S modification soon entered mass production and became a common sight in the coldest parts of the country. Besides the northern versions, the standard flatbed ZILs and their many variations gradually spread across the entire country. They began to replace the older 164 model, first on the outskirts, and later even in the most remote regions, where the aging trucks were finally giving way to the new 130s. Production kept growing year after year, and by 1974, the 1 millionth ZIL-130 rolled off the assembly line. It was painted in a festive, bright red color, something very unusual for the model. The truck was shown to the press, featured in newspapers and on television. But, contrary to expectations, it never ended up in a museum. Instead, it went into regular service, and what happened to it afterward remains unknown. The first facelift of the model came in 1980, and it's pretty easy to spot. The truck got a redesigned front end. But the changes weren't just cosmetic. There were also a few technical updates. Nothing major, but still nice to have. Engine power went up by 5 horsepower. The gearbox got new synchronizers that made shifting smoother. The brake booster was improved, so the brake pedal required less effort. Sound insulation got better, and the dashboard was completely redesigned. Still, the concept stayed the same. A reliable, simple, and tough workhorse. Production kept growing, and by 1982, the 2 millionth ZIL-130 rolled out of the factory gates. It was also painted in a festive red color. But time moved on, and the factory engineers understood that the 130 was slowly turning from a modern truck into an outdated one. Work on the next generation had actually started back in 1974, and several prototypes were built. The new design dropped the old rounded shapes for a stricter, boxier look. By 1985, production of the new model began, the ZIL-169, which by then had been renamed ZIL-4331. It featured an angular design, a 6-liter gasoline engine that was later joined by a diesel option, and a 5-speed gearbox. It took a while to bring the new truck to full-scale production, but surprisingly, the 130 wasn't retired. It was produced alongside the new model, and demand for the simple, familiar, and time-tested truck remained strong, especially in the provinces, and at plants that made various special versions based on the 130. Still, time did its job, and government contracts increasingly shifted toward the newer model. When the 1990s came and the Soviet Union was gone, demand for both the ZIL-130 and the newer model collapsed overnight. The economies of the former Soviet republics were in deep crisis. There was simply no money to buy new equipment. Private owners weren't doing much better either. Production somehow dragged on for a few more years, until January 1995, when the ZIL-130 finally left the main assembly line for good. You can really call the ZIL-130 the backbone of the Soviet system, and that's not an exaggeration. For decades, it was the main truck doing nearly all the hard work. Construction, farming, the army, public utilities. Wherever you looked, it was there. After some years of neglect in the 1990s, as the economy slowly stabilized, interest in the 130 unexpectedly returned on the used market, especially for the dump truck version. There was simply nothing else like it, no real replacement. And even today, in 2025, the ZIL-130 dump truck is still in demand and worth good money. In fact, not much has changed. There's still no real alternative, neither from local manufacturers nor from imports. Add to that its simple and time-tested design, cheap and easy-to-find parts, and unpretentious nature, and it becomes clear why the ZIL-130 is still working hard after all these years. And remember, it first appeared 69 years ago. But maybe you're wondering, how did it happen that a major factory in the capital, with top engineers, resources, and influence at the highest levels, failed to create a proper successor to the 130? Because let's be honest, the ZIL-4331 can hardly be called a true replacement. It came out too late and was already outdated by the time it hit production. And most importantly, it had very little potential for modernization or further development. That's a fair question, and the answer isn't simple. In the next video, I'll tell you a story that took place between the 130 and the 4331. A story full of drama, intrigue, and at times, pure absurdity. It's a very unusual chapter in ZIL's history, and it definitely deserves its own video. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. Hit the like button and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And if you'd like to support the project, consider becoming a channel sponsor. That's all for today. See you soon. with more fascinating stories ahead.